Hello, and welcome to this Brookings Doha Center webinar on arms sales during COVID-19. My name is Noha Abu Dahab, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion. For those of you who would like to listen to this webinar in Arabic, please select mute original audio on your screen, and then select French to listen to the Arabic interpretation. All right, so COVID-19 has forced many businesses around the world to shut down. But one industry that seems to have continued to enjoy business as usual is the global arms industry. A number of recent developments show that the pre-pandemic appetite for buying and selling weapons remains healthy, despite calls for a global ceasefire and despite the urgency of devoting efforts to and resources to healthcare and social welfare. As multi-billion-dollar arms sales persist during the pandemic and against the backdrop of financial crises and economic crises, questions emerge about the militarization of foreign policy. A couple of months ago, Canada announced that it would resume a very controversial multi-billion-dollar arms export deal with Saudi Arabia. And while the UK suspended its arms sales to Saudi Arabia following a Court of Appeal ruling last year, it increased its arms exports between 2018 and 2019 by about more than 300%, or about the equivalent of £1 billion, with many of those exports going to countries with a pretty bad human rights record. And as we speak, the issue of arms sales or arms exports to the Middle East and into the Gulf in particular has stirred up yet another storm within the US government. Just last month, the Trump administration fired Steve Linick, a State Department Inspector General, who was about to complete an investigation into the lawfulness of American weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and to the United Arab Emirates in 2019. So, what are the implications of the global arms industry during COVID-19 for arms exporters and importers in the Middle East? And how do arms exporters reconcile their support for a global ceasefire on the one hand and their continued support for militarization on the other? And do governments really have no choice but to sustain jobs created by the arms industry through continued arms sales, regardless of their use to kill and maim innocent civilians in places such as Yemen? So, to help shed some light on these issues, it's my pleasure to introduce our four speakers. Ambassador Dennis Horak joined the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs in 1987, and he has held assignments as political officer in Stockholm, Warsaw, Riyadh, and London. He was also head of mission in Tehran from 2009 to 2012, and served as Canadian ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, and Yemen from 2015 to 2018. He's currently retired and resides in Toronto. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. It's also my pleasure to welcome Dr. Diana Olbam, who is Senior Strategist and Legislative Director for Foreign Policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Dr. Olbam has nearly over 2 decades of experience on Capitol Hill, and during her time as a congressional staff member at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, she coordinated efforts to overhaul the outdated Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, improve oversight of arms sales and security assistance, and promote diplomacy and multilateralism. Dr. David Waring is a specialist on UK relations with the Gulf Cooperation Council states. He's also the author of Anglo-Arabia, Why Gulf Wealth Matters to Britain. He's contributed commentary and analysis to the New York Times, the BBC, Sky News, The Guardian, and many others. And he's also a teaching fellow in international relations at Royal Holloway University of London. Welcome, David. And finally, we have Peter Weiseman, who is a senior researcher in the Arms and Military Expenditure Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, also known as SIPRI. His research is on the global production and proliferation of conventional arms with a special focus on military expenditure and arms procurement in and arms transfers to the Middle East and Africa. He also monitors multilateral arms embargoes and maintains the CIPRI database on that issue. So a very warm welcome to all of you. To our audience, please do send in your questions through the Q&A function on your screen. We'll start, each speaker will give about 5 to 6 minutes of introductory remarks, after which we'll then kick off a discussion with a couple of questions from me, and then I will be taking your questions. It would be great if you could please keep your questions concise. All right, Ambassador Horak, let me start with you. Despite diplomatic tensions between Canada and Saudi Arabia, which of course hit a high point in the summer of 2018, as you very well know, Canada continues to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. So what exactly is strategic about Canada's bilateral relationship with the Gulf countries and with Saudi Arabia in particular? The floor is yours.
I'm not really sure that it's a strategic relationship per se. The thing is, we've been selling arms to Saudi Arabia, practically the same vehicles, the light armored vehicles to the Saudis, for example, for decades. Slid under the radar for the most part. I don't think most Canadians realize we even had much of an arms industry, frankly, and I think a lot of politicians didn't realize we did either. The large sale in February of 2014, I think, put it on the radar. But it's a relationship we've had for a while. In terms of the political engagement with the Saudis, it hasn't been, I think, to the level that they have wanted to have it. But certainly we viewed the Saudis as an important regional partner. Had dialogue with them on a variety of different things, but it's not something I would call necessarily a strategic relationship. I mean, frankly, I think the arms sales is about jobs as much as anything.
Okay, thank you for that. So if it's about jobs, aren't there other willing customers other than Saudi Arabia?
I mean, we do sell to others, but obviously the Saudis, I think, are one of the largest arms purchasers in the world. And the thing is, for the Saudis, in my experience, in any case, I think, you know, for them, the purchase of arms is more than about defense. It's more than about their defense needs. It's about building relationships. It's about building partnerships. So I think for them, these kinds of contracts are very much strategic. And I think, for example, with us, if they looked at it that way as well, this is about a recognition of partnerships. And certainly I think that's exactly the case with the United States. I think with Britain to a degree as well. I mean, very much so. So it's, you know, for us, yes, I mean, we use this and they wanted to use this to sort of leverage a broader relationship. And I think we looked at it to that degree as well. But as I mentioned earlier, I think not to the degree that the Saudis hoped that it would have. And certainly we saw that a little bit in the last couple of years that I was there, sort of 2018 in particular, when the criticism about the Saudis' human rights record started to become much more visible than it had been in the past. And I think they were disappointed in that. But I think we've seen this across the board with the Saudis, that's part of what their arms purchases are all about, these large, massive contracts. And it's about building partnerships and relationships.
And when you say that the level of engagement wasn't up to the level that the Saudis were hoping for, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, we had in the 3 years I was there, we had no bilateral visits. We had 2 visits by ministers under the rubric of various multilateral bodies. One was the Canada GCC dialogue. The other one was the what do they call it? The Davos in the desert. And again, 1-day visits on both scores. So I think they would have wanted a much more high-level, senior, sustained engagement by the Prime Minister and others, and visits back and forth, as most other countries do. Both, you know, the UK, the US, many of the European countries regularly have senior visitors into Riyadh and, you know, back to their capitals, and we just didn't have that, and really haven't for most of our history with Saudi Arabia, with the one exception being during the Harper government.
And Ambassador, do you think that the lifting of the moratorium on this multi-billion-dollar deal in April has anything to do with Canada struggling economically because of COVID-19?
No, I think it was inevitable anyway. There's a couple of factors that are at play here. One, there's a valid contract, and we have a legal obligation, and I think there's a reputational risk for Canada were we to just walk away from the deal. So I think that was part of it. Part of it, there is jobs, no question about it. These are high-paying, high-tech jobs in a part of the country where there's a lot of spin-offs from that deal. As I said, it's a company that has been involved with Saudi Arabia since the early 90s. So I think there was a whole range of issues at play there. Certainly, COVID and the economic pressures probably added to that, but I think it was always going to come back at some point because of these other factors.
Okay, and just one final question before we move to Diana. Should we expect there to be a deepening of this relationship between Canada and Saudi Arabia? Or is this kind of like a one-off, this lifting of the moratorium, especially taking into account this mounting domestic pressure, it seems, in Canada against these arms sales? There was this day of action that took place last Thursday against the arms sales, etc. So how do you see this relationship evolving?
It's a good question. I mean, in terms of this particular deal and the controversy around it, it really was the first time that Saudi Arabia became a political issue in Canada. I mean, this deal that was signed in 2014 became a political issue during the campaign of 2015, where Trudeau was elected for the first time. It was raised during the leadership debate, for example, and I don't think Saudi Arabia was ever mentioned before in the history of Canadian leadership debates. So it became political, which makes it controversial. So there were issues there, and it has retained its focus. I mean, it ebbs and flows depending on the situation, depending on various crises, controversies. For example, following the horrific killing of Jamal Khashoggi, there was a lot of attention again put to this deal. So that will ebb and flow. In terms of the broader relationship, I'm not sure we're going to see a deepening of it in anytime soon. What I would like to see is a return to some normality, to sort of where we were before 2018. Whether we'll get there, how we'll get there, are both good questions. I think it will take political engagement and political will on both parts. I'm not sure it's there, and I think this deal needs to be seen separate from that broader relationship.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll certainly come back to you for more questions on that. Okay. Diana, let me turn to you. So over the last couple of years, it seems several members of Congress, including Lindsey Graham, have tried and failed to halt American arms sales to repressive governments. Why is it proven to be so hard, and what needs to change? Is it really just a change in the laws?
Thank you so much, Noha. It's a pleasure to join you and these distinguished panelists here today, and I want to thank everyone for joining. So in response to your question, it is more than a change of laws. It's a change of attitudes that's required, although both are part of it. And let me just start with a painful truth, which is that official Washington does not recognize the hypocrisy of trying to save lives from the threat of COVID-19 on the one hand, while at the same time selling weapons they know will be used to kill civilians on the other hand. In fact, I would say the majority of Democrats and Republicans alike see global health security and global arms sales as completely unrelated. Now that denial may seem mind-boggling, but it rests on a few widely held but rarely acknowledged assumptions. The first is that to make Americans more secure at home, the US government must conduct sustained military operations around the globe without geographic or time limitations. And we at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is the Quaker Peace Lobby, have been working for years to try to repeal the blank check for war that is contained in the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, also known as AUMF. But even after spending $6.4 trillion on the post-9/11 wars, only to see the total number of terrorist attacks worldwide increase fivefold, Congress has been largely unwilling to acknowledge that the global war on terror is a failure. They've not been willing to repeal the 2001 AUMF or to force the president to end any current US military operations. The second problematic assumption is that the killing of innocent civilians, whether by US or partner forces, is a regrettable but unavoidable side effect of a war on terror that must be fought. It's the same kind of thinking that is behind the approach to policing at home, where brutality and killings are dismissed as the problem of a few bad apples that can be fixed with more money and better training. And only now are Americans beginning to question this assumption in large numbers. Finally, the national security establishment believes that global arms sales are essential to the US economy, particularly during this steep downturn and recession. Just in the last 2 months, Congress has been notified of $7.5 billion in foreign military sales, including to countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And this is especially troubling when you look at the facts. For every $1 billion invested in education, 15,300 jobs are created. $1 billion invested in healthcare creates 14,300 jobs. But in the military, it's less than half that number. But sadly, this is the mindset we are up against as we seek to end endless wars and dismantle US militarism and white supremacy, both at home and abroad. In order to succeed, we have to start by convincing Congress to reassert its own authority under the Constitution. It's Congress, not the president, that has the authority to declare war. But they have outsourced their powers to the executive branch because it's far easier and politically safer to have someone else take the blame if things go wrong. It's very convenient to not have to cast that vote that they might later have to justify and defend. Now, you've probably seen that Congress has repeatedly attempted to prohibit some of the most egregious arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, exactly what Noha was referring to. Both the House and Senate have passed resolutions of disapproval for the sale of precision-guided munitions that have been used to attack schools, hospitals, markets, weddings in Yemen. But President Trump vetoed those resolutions, and we did not have a 2/3 majority of the Senate that's needed to override those vetoes. Now, Congress could change these laws and processes. Instead of continuing a system where all arms sales proceed unless Congress acts to stop them, Congress could flip the script. It could rewrite the laws to prohibit arms sales unless Congress gives its explicit affirmative approval. But this is unlikely to happen unless the American public demands it, and sadly, foreign policy is rarely, if ever, a major factor in US elections. However, we do have a new opportunity for change as people connect the dots between Black Lives Matter and militarism, between systemic racism at home and the quest for US global military domination. Now, these are things I couldn't have said even just a few months ago and still be taken seriously as a foreign policy professional. But they're things that need to be said, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to do so.
All right, very interesting. Thank you so much, Diana. That was great. We'll definitely come back to you for questions. I'd like to move on to you, David. You've explained in your work how arms sales and other forms of military cooperation have been central to the UK-Saudi strategic relationship, which spans over a century. Following last year's court ruling that forced the government to suspend new arms sales to Saudi Arabia, how do you think the strategic relationship might change moving forward, especially with the current added layer of COVID and the oil markets, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So maybe to answer that, I could start by trying to place those arms sales within their wider context in the British case, and then I can go on to talk about the effect of the pandemic and the crisis. So, I mean, petrodollars are absolutely central to Britain's relationship with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. And starting with the arms exports element of the picture, I mean, arms exports sustain a military-industrial base, or help to sustain a military-industrial base that Britain needs if it's going to continue to be a leading military power in the world system, which of course is a major strategic priority that Britain's had since the empire started to fall apart. And half of Britain's arms exports go to Saudi Arabia. So to the extent that arms exports are important to maintain that military industrial base, arms exports to Saudi are important to maintain that military industrial base. So this is more of a strategic than a commercial consideration. It's less about the profits of BAE Systems, although that is quite important. It's more about the strategic priorities of the British state in the long term. Now, there's an economic dimension to this as well, which is really important. As I say, the arms sales fit within a broader picture. So inflows of petrodollars into the City of London, into the British economy more broadly, help to finance Britain's current account deficit, which is a product of the neoliberal turns. If you think about the neoliberal turn that Britain made under Thatcher and Blair, the sort of de-emphasising of manufactured exports and the emphasising of financial services, that shift produced a large current account deficit, which then had to be financed somehow. And one of the big pools of global capital that's been available to the British, not just in pure market terms, but because of the long-term strategic relationship, has been Gulf petrodollars. Gulf monarchs have sent their petrodollars to Britain, not just for commercial reasons, but also because Britain's a valued strategic partner. Similarly, petrodollar wealth in the GCC has made the GCC as a whole Britain's leading global south export market, which has helped to reduce further the trade deficit component of Britain's current account deficit. So British neoliberalism has been partly sustained, or at least by Gulf petrodollars, or at least Gulf petrodollars have played a significant role in sustaining the British neoliberal model. So you have to think about arms exports within that. The arms exports, as was mentioned before, there's a strategic decision from the Saudis as well. They help the Saudis maintain their alignment and their ties with their long-term protectors in Washington and London. So arms sales have that broader sort of strategic value, which is really important for both sides, holding together a relationship that's about not just arms, but capitalism as well. Now, if you think about the COVID picture, I think no one wants to make predictions about anything in 2020, but I think at least we can talk about the question marks that are raised by the COVID pandemic and the impact on the economy. So obviously there's been a huge collapse of demand for oil, and the effect on the oil price from that has been exacerbated by this crazy decision to launch an oil price war at the beginning of a collapse in demand, which has seen the oil price go negative even at one point. So obviously all that reduces the pool of petrodollars that are available for recycling in the various ways that I described in the UK Saudi. And this of course comes against a wider backdrop of decarbonisation, where the prospects for the fossil fuel industry internationally weren't good to begin with before COVID came along. So the recovery of the global oil price and the recovery of the pool of petrodollars available for recycling is likely to be much smaller in the longer term. Now, even if there's not much money going around, the Saudis still value their relationship with the British, and there's been reassurances apparently that arms sales won't be affected. But there's a tension here, I think, between the Saudis imposing austerity at home and continuing to make big arms purchases and lavish investments. Newcastle United is the high-profile thing, but it's smaller than all sorts of investments, including an oil fund. And you can see the political tensions domestically in Saudi perhaps opening up when people ask, well, why am I having to tighten my belt while we're still spending all these arms on bombing Yemen for 5 years running and achieving no result there, even if we think it's a good idea. So the bottom line in all of this, I think, is that the fossil fuel economy is the basis of British arms sales and everything else in the UK-Saudi relationship. But if the fossil fuel economy is on its way out, or to the extent the fossil fuel economy is on its way out, that raises questions around the relationship as a whole, including the arms sector.
All right, thank you very much, David. There's a lot to digest there. Peter, will the collapse of oil markets, coupled with the sort of economic fallout of COVID-19, I know it's still too early to make definitive statements on that, but sort of what do you think, you know, given that you follow military expenditure quite closely from a regional, perhaps also a global perspective, will there be a long-term or even a permanent impact on the military spending trends of countries in the Middle East?
Yeah, that's a very big question, which also will be asked by the many arms industries in the world, which have the Middle East as one of the important export regions, or at least have had that over the past years. Of course, just to say, to be very clear for the arms industry, it is still their local, in the kind of domestic markets, which are the most important for the US. The US companies focus on that as being the largest arms market in the world, the same in China, the same in Europe, and the same in Russia. But still, arms transfers to Saudi Arabia are an important part of arms trade in the world. Actually, Saudi Arabia has been the largest arms importer in the world, and 6 other countries in the Middle East and North Africa belong to the top 10 arms importers over the past 5 years. The UAE, Qatar, Algeria, Turkey, Israel are all amongst them. And of course, then the question is, can these countries, which have also very high military spending, especially very high military spending as a share of GDP, if we look at that, 7 of the countries with the highest military burden, or in other words, the highest share of military spending within the GDP, are actually in the Middle East and North Africa. 2 of them are not even included there because we don't have proper information about them: Qatar and the UAE. So the question again is, okay, will this change? Now we have a change in the oil prices, and of course the effect that the pandemic has on the economy as a whole, the lockdowns and other measures that are taken, and of course also the demand for more healthcare and other actions and activities to deal with the economic downturn. And the answer is we won't know really in actual facts until the end of this year at the earliest, because most of these states are not very open about their plans. Yes, there are, of course, cases where you hear that, for example, the UAE is interested in buying several billion dollars worth of new equipment. But the question is that just an interest, or have they already made a decision? Have they already signed the contract? Or if they haven't signed the contract, when are they going to do that? A lot of that information is unclear. The information we have is about the large arms deals and arms transfers and deliveries which we have seen in recent years. That is based on solid facts. But for 2020, we're still in the dark what the actual decisions are. In other parts of the world, countries are open about that. They have already announced cutbacks in some parts. In other parts, they say, well, no, actually the threat perceptions are such that we will continue with increases in military spending. We see that in Europe. But we don't have those kind of statements, clear policy documents which help us to understand what is going on in the Middle East. And that's what kind of the issue is. Now, can they sustain it? Based on historical facts, we have seen, for example, that when the oil price dropped significantly in 2015, it was followed by a very significant decrease in military spending in Saudi Arabia. I think it fell from about 90 billion to about 65 billion or so between 2015 and 2016. It increased a bit after that, but it hasn't recovered to that very high level of 2015. And so we can expect that the current pandemic and the effects of that also will have a similar effect on, for example, the military spending of Saudi Arabia. Unless, of course, there are other factors that are going to play. It could be that threat perceptions may increase at the same time, and that may counteract the kind of demand or the the lack of resources that we have seen, that we will see in the whole of the Middle East. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And then there is the other part of it, where it's not necessarily always about the big money. And here I talk about the way that in the Middle East, one thing has changed. We talk about business as usual, and there are two things which have changed in recent years. And that is that weapons are not just bought to maintain relations with the supplier states, not just bought because they are fancy or they give a certain prestige, but they're actually being used. Saudi Arabia, the UAE in particular, have actively used arms in Yemen. The UAE is very active in Libya against the UN sanctions. And so we see that there is a change there. And one of those changes is that it also involved, let's say, warfare on the cheap. You don't necessarily always have to acquire the big systems. You can also acquire relatively cheap equipment and supply that to your proxy forces, your proxies, your allies, such as Iran has done for many years. Hezbollah, Hamas, in Yemen we have seen that, but which has also been, you may maybe say, copied by in particular the UAE and Saudi Arabia, first in Syria and then also in Libya in the case of the UAE. So even if we would see a decrease in military spending there are other ways to continue the competition for regional power, for regional influence by using these relatively cheap means of basically waging war.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Peter. Ambassador Horak, I'd like to come back to you. You mentioned earlier that you'd like to see things go back to normal between Canada and Saudi Arabia to pre-2018. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? What do you mean by that? You'd like to see kind of no issues with arms sales, a deeper sort of strategic relationship. Could you just elaborate on that?
Basically a fuller relationship. We had a broad-based relationship covering a fairly healthy, at least in Canadian terms, fairly healthy trading relationship. The student exchange for the Saudi students that came to Canada, for example, there was, ranging year to year, usually between 10 and 15,000 Saudi students that would come to Canada every year, which is a benefit obviously for Canadian universities, but also in terms of building bridges between the two countries. And I think that was an important connection. I think it's an important sort of a soft power kind of situation for Canada. I think that's something that has suffered as a result of this. I think it undercuts to a degree our values agenda in terms of trying to demonstrate a different kind of way of life in Canada. And I think that that's a sort of message that goes back to Saudi Arabia. As with any Saudi student that travels and studies abroad, they become agents of change and reform when they go back. And I think that's something that we lost, for example. We had dialogue with them on various issues, on security issues and otherwise, and we were able to chat with them and have very frank conversations about human rights and other things that I think that serve certainly our agenda, but I think that also is a value in terms of the broader relationship. So I mean, that full scope relationship is what I was talking about, and whether it's about arms sales or about other sorts of trade, all of those sorts of aspects of the relationship, I think that were beneficial for both countries, and I think that's something that we need to get back to. It may inch slowly, incrementally, but I think some sort of broader, as I said, sort of return to normality, I think would be beneficial for us and for Saudis as well.
All right. Well, you mentioned the issue of human rights, but I mean, isn't that what triggered, these tensions and the spat? And how do you see Canada sort of retaining this kind of relationship while also, staying committed to a human rights foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think a lot of Western countries grapple with when it comes to Saudi Arabia, China, a number of countries. I mean, the list is very long, sadly. But you can have a dialogue, you can have a frank dialogue and still maintain a friendly relationship with the country. I think where the concern that I had at the time and continue to have is the Twitter diplomacy, if you want to call it that. this idea that you can capture the nuance of your position in 140 characters, I think is not, I don't think it's an effective tool of diplomacy, and I think that's where we stumbled. Now the Saudis, I think also the MBS was trying to make a point. Canada was a vulnerable target, and the tweet that was sent out, I think, provided the catalyst for it. But you can still have a relationship, I believe, with a country and still be critical and challenge them and speak with them frankly about human rights. Other countries do it without breaking their relationship, and I think the approach that we had, I don't think was effective. I don't think you can have an effective human rights policy which involves standing on the sidelines and waving your finger without having a broader engagement with a country. If the only dialogue you have with a country, the references you have to a country are to criticize it, you're going to get ignored. And I think that's the sort of that's the trap we fell into that I think a lot of other countries have avoided.
Okay, thank you for that. Diana, let's come back to you. You mentioned the importance of broad public support in the effort to put an end to such arms sales. So what would this broad public support in the US look like?
Well, it's starting to arise in any event. And I think that members of Congress were really surprised by how much they heard from constituents about the war in Yemen. At least prior to the COVID epidemic, it was really at the top of a lot of the news sources, and organizations like FCNL and Win Without War and a bunch of others were really successful in mobilizing public opinion against further US complicity in the Yemen war through its arms sales to Saudi Arabia and UAE. I think that's fallen off of the news for understandable reasons. However, I think, as I said earlier, that the whole mobilization around racism will also prompt people to understand how it affects US foreign policy, and thus issues like arms sales abroad are going to be, again, things that members of Congress hear from constituents about.
Okay, and I'd like to add another question to that. Many governments, and I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but many governments, including the US, of course, justify their continued arms sales to repressive countries by saying that these are important allies in the fight against terrorism. So do you think there in the work that you do you kind of try to address arms export control regimes and how they can tackle this issue of counterterrorism head on, and how would that look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's two factors. One is that arms sales are being justified, as many of my co-panelists have mentioned, as purely an economic matter, completely divorced from foreign policy considerations. And that is definitely the approach of the Trump administration, to speak of this in purely economic terms, creating jobs regardless of the consequences. But others who support arms sales for strategic reasons talk about it as being to support our partners, to be able to participate in anti-terrorist activities with the United States. And often they say, you have to sell the weapons to them so that we don't have to do the work ourselves. But that's based on the assumption that the way to end terrorism is to kill all the terrorists. And I think that our experience over the last 20 years is showing that that's just not true. So it's going to take some work to have people re-envision what an approach to US security is like, that doesn't seek to advance the safety and security of Americans at the expense of civilians around the world.
Okay, thank you for that. David, let me come back to you again about this issue of sort of broad public support. civil society, I think, played quite a big role in the UK in pushing for this court case, which then resulted in a court order last year forcing the government to suspend new arms sales to Saudi Arabia. What approaches in this campaign do you think were most effective? And what are some of the lessons learned that perhaps some other countries might benefit from?
I think just to be clear about that court decision, it was the court forbade the British government from awarding new licenses for arms exports. But sadly, the government had awarded plenty of licenses already in the preceding 4 years. And many arms transfers are continuing under those existing licenses. And of course, it's a question of transferring arms, but it's also a question of the sort of more practical support that the British give to the Saudis. So you've got technicians on the ground supporting the Saudi planes that are carrying out these bombing runs. So substantively, a lot of this support continues, which is not to completely negate the importance of that court case, but it came quite late, unfortunately. I want to say there's a good story to be told here about how effective civil society can be. And it's not a question of criticising British civil society, but the safeguards on British arms sales, which are really clear, you can't sell arms to a country if those arms might be used in serious violation of international law. Well, it's been clear from March 2015 that those arms almost certainly were being used in serious violation of international law. And you had a series of reports from the UN, from Amnesty, from Human Rights Watch, Save the Children, Oxfam, another report from the UN, another report from the UN, all documenting that this is precisely what was happening. But the British legal system wasn't able to issue a ruling that matched that legal position until June 2019. So it took 4 years for the British arms controls to properly come into effect because the government was so keen to violate. Now, in the role of civil society here was to pursue that judicial review process, to take the government to court, and then when it lost the initial case, to keep pushing it until it went to the Court of Appeal and finally got the decision that they wanted. So that was a success for Campaign Against Arms Trade, who were the leading campaigning group that pursued that judicial review. What's been, I guess, sadder in all of this is that wider British civil society has not made a huge amount of noise about Yemen, at least not insofar that would put pressure on the government to do its job and stop those arms sales, or do what it should do and stop those arms sales. So that whole convoluted legal process could have been beside the point if there was sufficient political pressure on the British government to say, no, this is just wrong and your arms control say you shouldn't be doing this, so you should stop it. The fact is that the British media hasn't talked about Yemen that much, not in the same way as it talked about Syria when it was someone else responsible for the atrocities. When it was our ally carrying out the atrocities of our help, the British media wasn't really interested. British civil society more broadly didn't talk too much about it. We've been obsessed with Brexit for the past few years. So there hasn't really been a huge amount of political pressure on the British government other than just after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, which I guess was a more digestible news story for the news media. And the minute that happened, if you remember, that's 2018, and coalition forces have been bearing down on Hodeidah port, and the UN was saying, if you fight over Hodeidah, there's going to be a famine the like of which the world hasn't seen in the last 100 years. The British and the Americans were ignoring those warnings until Jamal Khashoggi was killed. And then suddenly there's a big news story. Suddenly people start talking about the wider relationship with Saudi Arabia. And then there's pressure. And then the British and the Americans, because they're embarrassed, not out of principle, start putting pressure on the Saudis. And you get this sort of partial tentative ceasefire around Hodeidah. So there hasn't been a good news story to tell about British civil society and its effectiveness, other than the case of Campaign Against Arms Trade in terms of this judicial review process, which took far too long, and other than in the case of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, which just created a completely unpredictable opening, which did have some effect. Yeah, so it's not a great story from the point of view of British civil society, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, David. Peter, there's a question here from one of our viewers, basically asking, given that conflicts continue to rage in the Middle East, and the flow of arms is not exactly helping resolve those conflicts. Why are, first of all, what are some other ways to address ways to reduce the violence in the region? And why aren't governments employing more non-military solutions to these conflicts, to resolving these conflicts?
Yeah, I'm afraid I have more the answer to the question, why are they still doing so? What is it that drives the arms industry in Europe to continue to supply arms to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, and to a number of other actors in the region, including also quite recently in an upsurge in arms deals with Egypt, for example, another country which we haven't really talked about here, but where we also have a range of issues, of course, including an authoritarian regime, which is still allowed to buy basically anything it wants to have, including from most European states, including even from a country like Germany, which is known as one of the more restrictive arms exporting states in the world. So I think this is more the side of the question which I can answer. I wish I had an answer to the question of how can we find more, let's say, other means to solve the conflicts, both within countries, but also between the different countries in the region. But right now, it seems to be that both that the arms industry in a number of European states and in the US, but for that matter also in Russia, China, and even South Korea right now do find it more interesting to sustain arms flows to these major arms importing and major clients of them. And when I say that, there are, of course, a few, as already has been mentioned, a few, let's say, cases where countries have been more restrictive. The UK has been mentioned there, although there it wasn't the government itself which really wanted to take those restrictions, but it was forced by a court order to do so, which I guess at some point also will be kind of not so much overturned, as well as that the UK government will find ways to get around that. But in Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Finland, we have seen civil society movements which have been successful in saying, okay, arms supplies to some of these states are really going way too far. We cannot continue to do that, or we cannot start to do that. Those are the cases where I think there is, let's say, a strong civil society movement which calls for other ways to deal with conflicts in the Middle East. But this is not true, again, as we just saw in, for example, the US or in France, in Spain, in Italy. And of course, we already mentioned then, of course, what will be the effect of the pandemic. And of course, the pressure will be on to help those industries to survive, to help sustain jobs. And it is not so that the arms industry in itself is that big, is a driving factor in most economies, maybe in the Russian one, but not in the US and certainly not in European states. Without the arms industry or without arms exports to the Middle East, economies would still run. But at this point in time, of course, everything counts, every job will count. So it will be even harder for those groups which will seek less militarized solutions to conflicts in the Middle East to argue against the continuation of such big deals. And I just mentioned the case of Egypt. Just right now in Italy, they're having a major discussion about whether or not to sell a massive package of major arms, including ships, combat aircraft, helicopters, a lot more, to a country which already has been in an economic crisis for years, which has, as I said before, of course, an authoritarian regime, human rights abuses, etc. And still, the government of Italy is prepared to go ahead with these things. So the arms industry as a lobby is strong. And I think the question is also going back to how this may play in the Middle East itself. The arms industry will also do their utmost best to continue their relations with this close political elite, which we have in most Middle Eastern states, to convince them that military means are essential for their survival, essential for their ambitions to be regional powers here. And this leads to then more to the question, to which extent do European states, does the US actually want to control that kind of direct influence of the arms industry over the political elite in the Middle East? What is it? What can be done about that? And I think those are the key elements I want to highlight. Maybe also, it has already been mentioned, the relation between or what the objective is of arms sales. And whereas for the US, the objective of arms sales is still clearly including kind of the strategic relations and all that, even though the Trump administration has taken an even more economically driven perspective on this. In Europe, it is very hard to see often what the real relation is between arms sales to the Middle East and a Middle Eastern security policy by those states which supply the arms. We see that in Sweden. In Sweden, you are only allowed to export arms if it is in the interest of Swedish security policy or in the interest of the Swedish defense. And still, no one can really come here with a clear explanation how arms exports to the UAE linked to the Swedish security policy towards the Gulf, towards Yemen, etc. And in the end, it's quite clear that it is the economic motives that drive these kind of sales.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for that. Ambassador Horak, I'll come back to you. Do you think Canada should continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia?
I think we have to at this stage, at least in terms of our current contract. I don't think it's smart for us to walk away from a contract that the terms are being fulfilled. Then there's no indication that the terms of the deal have been violated, at least on a sustained basis. So that's important. In terms of future contracts, I think we have to look, as we always have with our export control system, what those arms are, what they would be used for, the appropriate guarantees about use, about violation of human rights, and those are the assurances. I think perhaps we can build up our the accountability on that front a little bit, perhaps. But I think certainly our export control system, I think, is vigorous in that regard, and the weapons that we have been selling, have generally not been used to violate human rights. And that, I think the focus there has generally been on their use domestically within Saudi Arabia. As one of the panelists was saying earlier, the nature of these sales is changing because they're actually being used. I think, in some respects, for a lot of countries, sales to Saudi Arabia and others, there was not the assumption, but there was this idea that, these are probably never going to be used. But when you sell arms, they do get used at some point, unless you're selling them for primarily ceremonial purposes, which I don't think anybody's doing, but I think that was a perception, I think, in some minds. So I think we do have to be maybe a bit more rigorous about the kinds of weapons that we're selling, but we have an arms industry here. It's maybe a bit off brand for Canada, but we do, and there are certain countries that are buying them, certain that aren't, and we have to look at that, and we have to look and see what sort of controls we could put in to make sure that that they're being used for the reasons for which they've been sold. So it's a tricky moral question, to be sure, but I think it's not just Saudi Arabia. If we have to decide, it's a more fundamental question: do we want an arms industry or not? And if we do, then we have to realize that they're going to be used, and that's the moral question that has to be addressed. And if we decide that, yes, we're going to have the arms industry, we have to reconcile that with the fact that they're going to be used and people are going to die as a result of that. So that's the fundamental question, I think, not whether it's to Saudi Arabia or Turkey or whomever, because once they're out the door, you're not really sure how they're going to be used. So it's always a little bit of a gamble.
But surely, there's this question of substantial risk, right? That the weapons will end up being used to kill innocent civilians and, be used in all sorts of different war crimes, etc. And that's really what, has made it very controversial. In Canada, you mentioned it's become a political issue, as an election issue, of course, but also the fact that, we have multiple reports about all sorts of human rights violations and war crimes happening in Yemen. So how can you separate that substantial risk, that context from a valid contract, as you call it? I mean, don't you need to take that context into account when you're assessing whether there is a substantial risk that Canadian arms will be used to kill innocent civilians?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. That's the assessment that you have to make, but it's going to be a risk regardless, because we have NATO as Turkey is a NATO member, and countries are selling arms to Turkey. I mean, you never know what's going to happen next. But I do take your point that the reports on the violations of international humanitarian law in Saudi. The thing is, the contracts that we have generally talk about, will these arms be used to violate human rights, not whether that country is a human rights violator. It's splitting hairs a little bit, but it's about the substantial risk of that being used to violate human rights. That's the way the laws have been traditionally written in Canada. Now that's going under some changes at the moment as a result of international treaties, etc. But in terms of what the contracts previously said and our export control regimes previously said, that's what it was all about. And there, to the best of my knowledge, there has been no evidence that the arms that we've said, the light armored vehicles in particular is what we're talking about, that they have been used in a manner that violates international human rights law. We're not selling planes and bombing. A lot of the LAVs, the light armored vehicles, are used principally along the border for border defense, which is why you sell arms to the National Guard, for example. Have there been skirmishes along the border? Absolutely. Have there been civilians killed? Very likely. But it's not, and this sounds horrible, it's not, I don't want to split hairs here, but it's not to the same degree or the same, at least to my knowledge, it may have changed, the same wantonness, if you will, that we've seen in the air war. And that does make a difference in terms of how you assess how those weapons are being used or not, because that's the nature of the export control regime that was in place when we sold them.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. Diana, while we're on this issue of human rights and war crimes, and I guess it's the broader issue of, aiding and abetting such crimes. So in the US, it seems that, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that there's a greater push to halt arms sales or at least suspend them. Why is there not a bigger push for accountability when it comes to aiding and abetting crimes? I know there was some activity there in the US government a couple of years ago, but why do you think do you think that would be a more effective approach to sort of focus efforts on accountability within the US?
Well, first, let me just acknowledge that we have serious human rights and civil rights abuses going on at home. And so, there is some level of hypocrisy on lecturing to other countries when we're not doing such a great job ourselves. But that said, we do have a responsibility to avoid making situations worse around the world, at very least have a do no harm approach to our foreign policy and our sale of weapons around the world. And I like your notion of accountability. And some of that starts with Congress. And like I said, it's much easier for them to continue the current system where there is a presumption of sale, a presumption of weapons exports. And unless they intervene at this very high level to stop them, which has never been done. Congress has never, by law, stopped an arms sale. There have been sales that were withdrawn after the administration heard and listened to objections from the public in Congress, but Congress has never been able to shut one off statutorily. So, accountability starts with Congress taking responsibility for these sales. They should be requiring risk analysis of every major sale so that before they make a decision about whether to allow a sale to go through, and they should have that affirmative responsibility to make that decision, they should have information about the likelihood that a particular sale will contribute to not only to human rights abuses, but to corruption, to aggression, to regional arms races, to retransfer to unauthorized third parties, which has been a huge problem. or to military takeover of civilian responsibilities. All these kinds of things ought to be considered before an arms sale is completed.
Okay, thank you very much, Diana, for that. Ambassador, I understand you need to leave.
That's right. I apologize, but it's unavoidable, I'm afraid.
No worries. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll just continue for a minute.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, we do only just have a minute or two left. David and Peter, do you have any sort of final remarks, some reactions to anything that's been said? Would anything that you'd like to add before we close? David first, and then Peter. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick remark about COVID itself and how it's affecting people. In Britain at the moment, it's the highest death rate in Europe. I think we've got the third highest death rate in the world. And we've got this huge debate about why it is that Britain's performed so badly in terms of public health in this case. And part of the focus has been on how late we were in imposing lockdown. And another part of the focus has been the austerity measures that the British government put in place through the 2010s after the financial crisis, and the impact on the National Health Service and how we weren't then equipped to deal with COVID. And what we've not been talking about, and I think other arms suppliers to the Saudis should be talking about this as well, is the extent to which Yemen isn't prepared for COVID in a way that makes Britain look like South Korea. I mean, Yemen really isn't prepared for COVID, and one of the big reasons that Yemen isn't prepared for COVID is because the Saudis have been pulverizing Yemen with our help. I mean, when you read those reports that I mentioned earlier, specific mention of hitting all sorts of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, including clinics, and destruction of the economy more generally. So you've got a country now which is uniquely exposed to this pandemic, and the impact on the US, the impact on Brazil, the impact on Britain has been horrific. But it's pretty scary when you think about what could happen in Yemen. And I think the countries that have sold arms to the Saudis and helped them do this to Yemen really have to reflect on their responsibilities there.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. Peter, some very quick final remarks.
Very quick. One thing has been mentioned that the arms industry is something where you find many high-tech jobs. And this, of course, relates immediately also to the COVID and the pandemic question. It is, of course, the case that those high-tech jobs might be more profitable, either in money terms or in the actual terms of what they could give us in the type of products which they could deliver to help us deal with a pandemic. And there, of course, the question is always, is it really true that the arms industry is giving that much? Shouldn't we actually look at how these people could work in other sectors and, as I said, be more profitable and more efficient for the things we actually need? And secondly, it may be important also to talk about, yes, arms industries can only survive if they export. That is true for many states, although it's not necessarily true for the United States, I think. But it is true for Sweden, for the UK, for Canada, for Germany too. But the interesting thing is here that all those states, despite the fact that they are close military allies, each have their own export policy. They don't really work together. It would be so much more efficient if they could say, we bundle our own procurement needs and we make sure that the arms industry feeds into that, so that we don't have to say we need to maintain an arms industry for ourselves and therefore have to export. That is one of those things which should be explored more. That is one of those kind of possible contributions to trying to limit the flow of arms to the Middle East, where, as I said, the weapons are actually used nowadays, not just supplied and just posing a threat, but they're actually being used in Yemen, in Libya, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and even between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, even though they haven't been used in actual war, but they have been used to threaten each other. So I think that's a very important thing to take into account.
Thank you very much. Thank you Diana. Thank you, David. Thanks to all of you for joining us for this fantastic discussion. We've covered quite a bit of ground, I think, and I really appreciate the time you took to join us. The link for this webinar will be up in a few days for anyone who missed it live or who wants to watch it again. So again, thank you, and we'll hope to see you at the next Brookings Doha webinar. Bye for now.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.